Hello and welcome to week 9 of this course, Philosophy 111. And this week we're going to continue our discussion of concrete issues, excuse me, in technology, in science and technology. And this week, week 9, we're going to be looking specifically at a couple of issues around gender and contemporary technology. And our two readings for this week are Jane Marie Maher, and her collaborators, and the essay is New Forms of Gendered Surveillance, Intersections of Technology and Family Violence. And the second essay is by Milivojevic and Seagrave, and it looks at the issue of e-trafficking and its gendered exploitation in the digital border crossing and analysis of the human trafficking and information technology nexus. So there is some overlap with these articles, as we'll see, and they're both looking at the way that new technology has problematized, has made problematic a previous area of human activity. In the case of trafficking, of course, it's sort of intensified. E-trafficking has added sort of new dimensions to that problem, and in the case of new surveillance technologies, has sort of changed and really made more problematic in some ways the issue of domestic violence and how to counteract it. So we're going to look at these two issues this week. All right, let's start with Maher et al. Maher and her colleagues, who are looking at the impact of new digital technologies in the realm of family violence. And so Maher and her colleagues claim that men's capacity to perpetuate violence against intimate partners is facilitated by the new digital technologies. These new technologies that significantly expand opportunities for surveillance and harassment. So it's the way that the technologies sort of play into an already problematic situation and create further possibilities that can intensify and expand the harassment through surveillance and through electronic forms of surveillance, as we'll see this week. All right, so let's take a look at this context that they talk about here with technology and intimate relations. And really what's straightforward, I think, that communications and social media have brought about a profound change in the nature of intimate relationships. As people are using these sites, as people are sort of developing profiles and developing sort of shared profiles across a number of sites, the amount of information available online has expanded radically. The amount of information you can trawl about any single person, and in the process has changed our sense of privacy and the sense of what privacy means and our expectations of privacy, and it's led to the possibility of new forms of invasive monitoring. And there's been some discussion of that in a public sense with sort of official kinds of spying and state spying and so on. But this is here we're talking about the domestic issue here, where it allows partners to invasively monitor each other, and so collapses expectations of privacy in the private sphere that had sort of developed prior to the technology with expectations of privacy. Of course, the technology is only sort of intensifying the possibilities, and even without the technology, of course, you can have quite intense harassment and sort of violations of privacy and so on. But it's the sort of extension of those, it's the extension of that potential with the new technologies and the use of the shared data and the new forms of monitoring available that has created a new context and led to this discussion of the new forms of gendered surveillance. So the authors give us a list here of some of the things that constitute technology-facilitated violence in intimate relationships. So again, forms, these many forms would have been sort of prevalent before the technology, but it's the sort of the re-intensification really that the technology makes possible, and the fact that it enables the kind of control and surveillance to be carried on across distances, whereas previously that would have been more difficult to sort of have that constant sort of threat, the constant prevalence of that threat. But of course, with technology, it can be made more real. So things like repetitive and abusive text messages and emails is always sort of a very common thing in cases of abuse, to have repetitive text messages. Checking or hacking email accounts is another extra sort of invasive action. Monitoring internet use, various kinds of spyware can be put on computers to monitor internet use, which is again sort of invasive and done in secret, and so on. Revenge porn, using video and photographs from a relationship to harm and humiliate somebody after the event. Harassing or threatening a person on social network sites, again sort of a very sort of unpleasant thing, but something that's become very prevalent. Location tracking, again through forms of spyware or apps that can track somebody's location, again without them knowing it. And of course smartphone spyware to sort of check on the different what's being used, what somebody's doing on their phone, and so on and so on. So in all these ways we can see that technology is sort of facilitating the possibility for an intensification of abuse and intensification of violence in intimate relationships. And the use of abusive text messaging, as I said, is very common. According to several recent reports that the authors talk about, its use damages the victim's sense of safety and creates a feeling of constant surveillance, and the feeling of sort of constantly being watched, of constantly being under surveillance, changes a person's sense of basic safety and security, and creates a sort of a sense of vulnerability. I think that's very significant. So this has become a very, one of the most common forms of abuse. And of course, there are loads of technology platforms facilitating kinds of surveillance. These days, a lot of them operate without the person knowing that they're being spied on. So these apps can combine location tracking, financial monitoring, and other constant tracking and surveillance. So it's the combination of features which makes them quite powerful. You can sort of see what somebody's doing on their phone, what they're using, what they're up to, who they're speaking with, and you can track somebody's movements. You can track where they are when they're doing different things. You can monitor what they're spending money on. So there's a whole host of these applications with names like NetSpy, Spyera. One of them's called Wife Spy. And they're very insidious applications that run without somebody being aware of them. And so they just gather a lot of data on somebody's activity and somebody's movements, and make that information available for somebody else to monitor and control. So it's we can see it's a very sort of significant intensification of surveillance capabilities as more of our life goes online, and more of our life is accessible as data, from things that we've done, from apps that we've used, from sort of things that we've bought or purchased online. So these applications can gather all of that information and sort of put it into a format to make it accessible for surveillance purposes. So these are all fairly new applications, but of course the fact that there's a number of them suggests that people are using them. So the loss of privacy is a really significant concern in this context. New digital technologies that have allowed abusers to make themselves omnipresent in their partners' lives obviously pose a threat to privacy and to expectations of privacy in intimate relationships. Even leaving the relationship does not necessarily protect against the reach of surveillance, threats, and violence, because of course that electronic connection can be maintained even if a sort of physical connection is no longer there. So that's been a significant feature, that the abuse can, through electronic means, the surveillance and the abuse can continue even sort of after the relationship is finished. So leaving the relationship doesn't necessarily give a sense of closure, doesn't necessarily lead to the end of the threats and the abuse. So this is the sort of the extension that the technology makes possible, the extension, the sort of electronic extension into people's lives that sort of intensifies the surveillance capabilities. As a response to this, we're seeing some online services emerging which help victims consider their options, and also platforms to help them consider and assess their own security risks, and which provide pathways to support services. One of these is 1-800-RESPECT, which is a counseling service, sexual assault and domestic family violence counseling service. There's also platforms like iDecide, which are platforms that help victims consider their options and sort of provide information and give them a kind of process to go through to assess the nature of the risk that they face. And then through that sort of assessment, victims can decide for themselves whether it makes sense to sort of leave straight away, to stay, to seek, what kind of help to seek, and who to contact. So it's a kind of self-assessment, a risk self-assessment thing, which sounds like a positive idea, right? That victims are sort of assessing themselves and are able to assess their own risk. But there's something worrying about this as well, that it does suggest a kind of privatization of responsibility, that it looks like the victims are sort of responsible for deciding themselves, and shouldn't there be some kind of public and official assessment as well? Shouldn't there be some state-led process to help victims to provide them some other kind of support? So this is sort of typical of many sort of uses of technology these days, but it privatizes the risk, and that could be a significant problem. So one troubling feature of these approaches is that they put the responsibility on female victims to protect themselves, often by separating themselves from public and social life. So that's a criticism that Maha and her co-authors are quite insistent on it in this article, that a lot of the approaches to abuse sort of rely on the idea of victims protecting themselves by making decisions to make it less likely that they will be abused. But of course, that often means taking decisions to separate themselves from public and social life, where there might be some danger of abuse and there might be danger of threats. So separating themselves from public and social life is a response to that. But of course, that puts the onus on the victim and leads to a significant reduction in their capabilities, in their opportunities, and sort of promotes the idea of protecting oneself by a sort of withdrawal from public and social life, and that doesn't sound like the best solution, insofar as it sort of it promotes the abuser's goal of isolating the victim, of separating them from their environments, from their social contexts, and it seems to play into that idea. So there's something counterproductive about this sort of putting the onus on the victim to protect themselves, especially where that means that they're going to be encouraged to increasingly isolate themselves from spaces where abuse might take place. Isolation is, of course, one of the things that leads to greater vulnerability and greater vulnerability to abuse. So that raises the question, how to address domestic violence and abuse without viewing violence as a private matter or putting the responsibility for dealing with it onto the victims themselves. Right? So is there a better way of dealing with that problem? And this is where the authors mention Judith Butler's precarious life. And in particular, they're drawing on an idea about vulnerability that Butler mentions in this article about the connection of vulnerability and violence. And the idea that a shared or common vulnerability is the source of our ethical connection to others. So a shared vulnerability means we can understand violence as communal and relational rather than individual and private. Right? So violence should call forth a communal response, a relational response, one that encourages us to sort of to build up our relations, to sort of have a communal answer that draws us into communal space, rather than isolating and individualizing and sort of and privatizing individuals in response to the abuse. So that communal and relational idea is something that that comes from Butler. And in what she says in the book, as the authors talk about on page 23, she says, each of us is constituted politically in part by virtue of the social vulnerability of our bodies. Such socially constituted bodies attached to others at risk of losing those attachments, exposed to others at risk of violence by virtue of that exposure. Right. So it's our relation, it's our attachment to others, and sort of that ethical connection that is both the source of our vulnerability and the sort of the communal should be the communal response to any acts of violence or abuse. So we're situated with others in communal and relational ways, meaning that our response to violence should enforce, should firm up those communal and relational links, reaffirming that it's our sort of shared vulnerability that makes us that exposes us to violence in the first place. So the response should be shared and communal rather than individualizing and private. All right, let's turn now to Milivojevic and Seagrave, and their essay focuses on the new context of trafficking that's come to be called e-trafficking. Which is basically human trafficking enabled through the internet or other communication platforms. So as we will see, technology has a dual valence in this debate. So it's not one thing or the other, but it seems to sort of intensify both things. Technology is often perceived in this debate as part of the problem. It's a facilitator of trafficking. Traffickers use it. And also part of the solution, so it's also become a kind of tool for disrupting trafficking as well. So it sort of it works on both sides, if you like. It's both part of the problem and it's also part of the solution. So Milivojevic and Seagrave are going to discuss what this looks like in practice, and also suggest some possible responses to this new connection. So one of the important earlier writers on this subject was Donna Hughes, who worked for a number of public agencies and went on to lead the Council of Europe group on trafficking and technology. And her take was that, as she said, the sexual exploitation of women and children is a global human rights crisis that is being escalated by the use of new technologies. So at this time, these issues were first sort of really coming into public view, and Donna Hughes was one of the first people really talking about this new context and sort of developing ideas around it. So what's sort of interesting here, and later would become problematic, of course, as we'll see, is the linking of women and children as sort of being both vulnerable populations. So during this early stage of the conversation on human trafficking, the conflation of women and children as at risk infantilized women and reduced them to passive victims. And this was done in the sense of, as we'll see, a sort of idea of protection. An agenda of protection was sort of driving this idea. But by conflating women and children as both sort of at risk in the same way, it sort of presented a very infantilized picture of women's agency. And so the kind of solutions and the way it went about tackling the problem tended to picture the women concerned as passive victims rather than as agents in their own right, who may have been capable of responding in certain ways given the right information, the right resources, and so on. So it sets them up as passive victims, and that conditions the nature of the response, which then becomes a kind of strongly protectionist response against people who can't protect themselves. So Milivojevic and Seagrave say the idea that women and children as victims have been placed at the heart of the technology trafficking nexus in the course of this debate, with the consequence of consolidating dominant expectations that certain behaviors are extraordinarily risky. Right, so the sort of the way it goes in by sort of seeing by creating this sort of idea of victimization and victims of this sort of technology trafficking context. So the idea of victimization suggests and sort of leads to the idea that people need protecting from certain behaviors which are risky, and so that leads to a sort of an approach to trafficking which becomes about the policing of the behavior of victims, rather than sort of trying to promote their agency. It leads to a policing of their behavior and a policing of their choices, and leads to the sort of the categorizing of certain types of behavior as extraordinarily risky, ones that must be ones that must be prohibited. So surveillance comes to be seen as necessary for the protection of women and children, and once that step's taken, right, then surveillance comes to be seen as important for the protection agenda, for the agenda of protection, and the way that it allows for control of the behavior of victims is kind of overlooked here because of the sort of perceived importance of the agenda of protection. So the problem that the authors see here is that by this idea of prevention and protection leads to the creation of a new kind of harm. So the expansion of police powers through this idea of protection, and the limitations of privacy through surveillance and data retention affect women disproportionately because they are seen as being most at risk and vulnerable, right? So the use of surveillance and the sort of collection of data is targeted at those populations who are seen as being at risk and vulnerable of e-trafficking, and so they are the ones under surveillance, and so that creates a large potential for abuse and a large potential for new forms of control that use this data to control the movements and the actions of vulnerable people. So Milivojevic and Seagrave identify three key consequences of this approach to e-trafficking. First is about surveillance, data retention, and disabling technology. So one of the things it does is it increases the surveillance of women in the sex industry and in digital spaces more broadly. So in those spaces, trafficking is seen as a danger. So there has to be more surveillance of women who work in those industries. But of course, that means those spaces become more policed. And the women working in those spaces become more subject to police action, and other consequences leading to over-regulation of the internet, with the shutting down of sex industry-related websites used by women who work in the industry. Craigslist was a famous example here, which was shut down specifically over the connection with e-trafficking. And more generally, the blurring of the distinction between sex work and sex trafficking. So this is the point about where sort of other actions and other things get sort of drawn into this surveillance mix and then become seen as problematic behaviors, as risky behaviors, and sex work has sort of taken on that. That has sort of come into that category. It's more heavily policed and regulated. And so women working in that industry increasingly sort of come under this heavier surveillance, and this sort of over-regulation. So in these ways, it sort of polices more of these spaces, and there's a sort of greater entry of the surveillance into these spaces that are seen as sort of risky and ones where women are potentially subject to abuse. Increased immobility is a second consequence that they talk about. Anti-trafficking campaigns often have the result of limiting the mobility of poor women, especially those from the global south, who might have aspirations to sort of move to the north. So their mobility is often limited as a result of these campaigns. Potential victimization is used to pass laws and regulations limiting the mobility of women. So here we see the same dynamic, that the sort of fear that they'll be victimized, that they'll become victims of e-trafficking, leads to the increasing regulation of certain types of work, of women working in certain spaces, and those regulations limit their mobility and limit their agency and limit their ability to make their own choices. So the third consequence, and again, something we've been talking about really, it's over-criminalization and the new punitiveness. So again, focusing on women's victimization makes it more likely that the solution will appear to be criminalization and surveillance, right? So when you start with the premise that women are sort of victims who need protection, the solution is likely to look like criminalization of certain activities and greater surveillance, leading to the potential of greater control of movement and control of behavior and so on. So this leads to calls for increased sanctions for traffickers, website operators, etc. as well. So what can we conclude really from looking at these issues, and we'll take up this discussion on the discussion board with surveillance. New technologies have increased the possibilities for surveillance and harassment of intimate partners, as we've seen, and the reach of surveillance, and this is the new context, the reach of surveillance and harassment can now extend far outside the home, and it doesn't end when the relationship ends. So that sort of extension of surveillance, the new invasive capabilities, are part of are part of the what's made possible by the new technologies. And the issue of e-trafficking, we saw how a protectionist approach can limit women's rights of mobility, of movement, of ability to access public spaces, and so on. So this idea of protection puts women in the passive situation of depending on the state and law enforcement. Instead of a different approach would be of seeking to enhance their own agency and mobility. As Seagrave and Milivojevic say, the threat of e-trafficking amalgamated with the gendered narrative of naive women who cannot navigate online spaces. So that's sort of part of it too, this idea of naivety, that sort of, they need extra help and protection because they can be exploited very easily, has been addressed through the rescue narrative and a range of protectionist interventions that impede women's agency. As such, e-trafficking provides yet another example of how a protectionist agenda additionally limits women's rights. So that's sort of the key idea here, that by sort of focusing on a protectionist approach and focusing on victimization, it leads to a solution which sort of limits agency, instead of trying to look for a solution that would see the women concerned here as agents in their own right.